Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Village Global Venture Stories. I'm here today with a returning guest, Nadia Eghbal. Nadia, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So Nadia, our last episode was called What Nadia Eghbal Thinks About Basically Everything. And just when I thought we had covered everything, Nadia recently came out with a book, Working in Public. Talk about the why behind this book and what you were trying to achieve with it. What was sort of the mission behind it?
Yeah, so I mean, it started out innocently enough with a desire to, just after having spent the last few years looking deeply at the world of open source software and just the developers that power it, I felt like there wasn't a substantive document anywhere that I had found that really reflected what was going on in kind of the modern world of open source today. A lot of any books that really exist on the topic tend to cover what happened maybe like 20 years ago, but I felt like the world could use a little bit of an update of what was going on. And so it kind of just started out as me wanting to summarize some of my research on open source. But in the process of writing it, I came to kind of get to more of like the why in the book, which was realizing that open source really reflected what was happening on the internet at large, where we are going from these hyper public social spaces to these sort of like quieter little corners of the internet where we feel more comfortable expressing ourselves. And I think a lot of that is just a product of scale of so many people are both in open source communities and online communities at large. There are just like so many people that are being crammed into the same room now that we're seeing sort of like new types of ways of connecting to each other and talking to each other develop. And so I wanted to chronicle that a little bit in the book.
Yeah. And let's talk about some of the misconceptions you were trying to debunk in the book. One is that when people who are not in open source have this idea of open source, it's sort of this like happy, friendly sort of place where everyone is contributing, and it's sort of this like, you know, kibbutz almost, or like commune style, and everyone is doing equal work. And you just added a lot more nuance to that narrative, and sometimes saying, oh, actually it's often just a few people, and it's actually better that way for reasons. Why don't you sort of unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to delineate at least that there are different types of styles, I guess, of communities that are forming now. I think like much of our language that we use right now to describe communities, whether they're open source communities or online communities more broadly, really just focus on that one model you're talking about, which is kind of like this idealized, equitable, like everyone putting in their share of the work kind of thing that we might experience with a small group of friends, like, you know, 5 friends that are working on a project together. And sometimes maybe not even then. But like as you're dealing with communities of, say, millions of people, it's just, I think, not really realistic to imagine that it continues to follow this perfect model of everyone kind of chipping in their part. And so I wanted to just sort of like identify like what are some of those different models that are emerging, and one of which is this stadium style community that you're kind of referring to here, which suggests that there are some open source projects where they are really just centered around one or a couple of maintainers who are doing most of the work. And so their job kind of like changes, and the way they think about their relationship to that community changes, where there are more of these like air traffic controllers that are dealing with an influx of very noisy interactions with a much broader base of casual contributors and casual members and participants. And I think we should sort of like recognize that some of those like structures exist where a maintainer does have a lot more of a stake in that community than a casual commenter or drive-by contributor. And I think we can kind of apply that sort of model to what we're seeing in online communities more broadly, where instead of having, let's say, maybe like a Facebook group or like an online message board or something where you can picture like lots of people kind of flitting in and out and forming this sort of like collective group thing, we're seeing not just that model exist online, but also these creator-centric communities. So like you can picture like a newsletter, which might have thousands of subscribers, but all those subscribers are kind of oriented around like one person who's the writer. And that just creates a very different sort of structure with a different set of expectations than the online communities that we're used to.
My Straussian reading, or one of the Straussian readings of the book, because you're very Straussian, Nadia, is that it's an anti-communist book. Is that accurate?
That's a little bold. I'm not anti really most things, I guess. But I do want to underline that there are, I do think it's a reaction against some of that early rhetoric that really characterized like the early days of the internet, where it was all about this idea of like, if we just connect more and more people together, then we're like asymptotically approaching this state of like so-called like perfect democracy or something like that, which I think was sort of an impossible premise to set up. And so we are seeing, as we continue to cram more and more people in the room, is that happening? It seems like there's actually some sort of like decline in sort of like relative freedom of expression, what people are comfortable with, that is happening. And so I kind of wanted to get to the root of that and say, okay, like at what point does that model actually break down, and not necessarily rejecting it, but just saying that we can't really sort of blindly cling to that model as something that we're aspiring towards that is sort of impossible to fulfill.
Yeah. Noah Smith had this great line. He said, the internet, promised to give everyone a voice, and it did. And you shouldn't be surprised that when a lot of people got a voice, the first thing they said was, fuck you.
Sad but true, yeah.
So some people have said that what happened with Gamergate in sort of the gaming industry was sort of like a template for what has happened in other industries or what's to come in other industries. And that's why understanding Gamergate is so important. We're going to get to Gamergate in a bit. But on the open source side, you seem to also believe that there are a lot of lessons about how things have played out in open source that are either applying to other industries currently or will apply in the future. Talk a little bit about what you think are some of the biggest lessons in terms of that we can glean from what's happened in open source to other spaces.
Sure. I mean, just sort of, I guess, riffing off of the controversy that you're referring to here, I again think there's sort of this impossible premise set up where in open source, there's this rhetoric and a sort of like common norm that everyone should be encouraged to participate and contribute. The beauty of open source is that anyone can submit a change to a project and potentially have that accepted. And so it gives us this sense of like agency over the world that is built around us, which I think there's still some truth to that sentiment. The flip side is what happens when like hard things happen in a project, for example, governance conflicts. And so I cited a few different examples in the book. Situations where maybe like the maintainer has said something that other people don't agree with, or there's just sort of like maybe like ideological conflicts where suddenly that maintainer is dealing with an influx of like tons and tons of outsiders coming in and sort of like weaponizing this rhetoric now against them, where they say open source is supposed to be a place for anyone to contribute. I don't feel comfortable contributing to this project because you hold so and so views. And using that to sort of like leverage, like, this is why we need to kind of like, flood in here and tell this maintainer what we think should happen, or like oust them or whatever. And so it really like goes against, I guess, a lot of these same principles that people are referring to around like how to build healthy communities, which I also kind of cite in the book of referring to, say, like Elinor Ostrom, who was a Nobel Prize winning economist who looked at the like how commonses or like small self-managing communities organize themselves successfully. And one of the things that she consistently points to in her work is the importance of knowing your membership boundaries and being able to sort of define like who is actually in charge here, like who has agency to sort of like make these kinds of governance related decisions. And so that stands really in conflict with the idea that like anyone can kind of come in and say like, we're now deciding what your community is doing. And so I think like we can really see that stuff happen in open source more so, I think, than maybe other online communities, partly because open source really has this like utility function that maybe like other online communities, it's not quite as obvious. And so like a lot of these open source projects are what we're using to run like all of our software that all of us are relying on. And so it's, I understand the other side of it as well, where it's like, if I don't feel comfortable contributing to this project, it's also saying that somehow like I'm not able to participate in something that that might like personally affect me. If I'm a developer relying on this code and I don't feel comfortable contributing back to it, then like now like now like my agency is also diminished. And so it really creates these just like very interesting conflicts where maybe with like an online community might say, all right, I'm going to go start my own over here. And that does happen in open source where projects will kind of like splinter off and try to start like a competing version. And but then you're still, I guess, competing for like which one is the standard project that people are going to use. But yeah, I think there's just sort of like this interesting logical puzzle of on the one hand, we say that healthy communities require having these sort of like clearly defined membership boundaries in order to be able to like know like who is like voting or making a decision on something. We can't just have like everyone in the world voting on it, or the decision loses its meaning. But on the other hand, like that can come into conflict with the idea of like open and participatory internet.
Yeah, I want to get to democracy in a couple minutes, but first, you quote Kevin Systrom in the book, quoting him: "Social media is in a pre-Newtonian moment where we all understand that it works, but not how it works." What precisely do you mean there in terms of like what would it mean for us to know how it works, and is it just time such that we see enough experiments play out, or how do you sort of think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we are still in the like bottoms up kind of approach to understanding how it works right now. The sort of like apple falling on our head, and then like looking up and you're like, what the heck is going on here? Because I mean, it has just been interesting to watch, say, like post 2016, where I think there has been this sort of revisiting of what the heck is social media, and like how do we be a little bit more thoughtful in treating it as with the, I guess, like social responsibility that we've all sort of been tasked with. And it just like for the first couple of years, I felt like everyone was kind of just flying blind, because it was, I think there, at least within tech, there was a little bit of this mental shift of we're this, I don't even know, like entertainment or product or like a private company that is not like a government at all, and we don't have the power to influence major social movements or changes. And I think there's sort of like a dancing away from that responsibility to now thinking about, oh gosh, like we really are the infrastructure upon which all our communications are happening, and we need to take that seriously. But yeah, I think there's still this feeling of like, but like what principles or like theory do we fall back on to understand that? And at least, again, this is just all sort of speaking from my own experience being in tech, but I felt like there's more recently been this revisiting of interest from I guess maybe your more typical software engineer interest in like political philosophy, or just like trying to find some sort of like fundamental thing to look back to and be like, okay, this is what helps guide how we build. And so I wanted to make a contribution to that with this book, because I think open source has a lot of just really interesting components to it that can also be kind of broken down and saying, okay, like here is the atomic unit of a contributor or of a maintainer, and like, can we take those same atomic units and like repurpose them to different types of online communities, and hoping to sort of like tease out what are some of those principles that we need in order to like rebuild our social platforms.
Yeah. Is there something that didn't make the book that you wanted to put in but weren't yet set on, or is there a sort of response to the book or a debate that the book has contributed to that is really compelling or interesting right now, sort of within open source or more broadly?
I've asked this question before. I don't think I held back on anything here. I kind of like leaned into the fact that I think books are great because for someone to read it, they really need to like parse through a lot of stuff. Like, there's a difference between buying a book and then actually reading it. And so I think I felt comfortable being like, if someone is taking the time to read this book, then they have the full context for what I'm trying to say. And so I didn't really hold back on anything as I was laying things out.
Yeah. How about the response to it? Or is there sort of a debate within open source that your book sort of weighed in on any capacity, or how do you sort of think about that?
I've definitely felt some, I guess, silence from people who've been typically more promotional of the things that I've written. But then at the same time have like, I guess I haven't heard a lot of like overtly negative things. It's mostly been really positive, but there's maybe some silence there. I don't mind. I think like part of like getting to the point of writing this book meant that I already, I think, have built up a level of context and relationships with a bunch of folks in open source, that it's not someone coming totally out of left field and saying this stuff. So I think like having a little bit of that trust is helpful. And yeah, I think it's like helped to sort of like bolster maybe like the same things that this is what I only ever want to do, because like I consider myself, an outsider to open source, even though I spend a lot of time around it, but I'm not an open source maintainer myself. And so like my hope is, it's like helping to amplify the things that people are already saying. I found it a particularly gratifying moment for me was when Guido van Rossum, who authored Python and stepped down, I think 2 years ago, due to, as he was sort of like the BDFL, the benevolent dictator for life of Python, and stepped down in part due to sort of like these exhausting kinds of conversations and discussions that I try to cover in the book, of like these things eventually wear down on maintainers like Guido. And he shared out the book and recommended it as a read. And that was sort of a nice validation kind of thing.
Totally. And for anyone who either disagrees with it or doesn't feel like it, 100% represents their version of the world, is it largely because, with love and care, you splash a little bit of cold water on sort of this utopian, vision?
Yeah. I mean, I think like there really is there are several defining eras of free and open source software, and the first kind of being free software, which is very ideologically driven, and then there was early open source software, which is kind of what I call it for lack of a better term, but that's all this stuff that came up around like the early 2000s, late 1990s, where the term open source was coined. And with it came all this rhetoric around the benefits of open source are that everyone can participate. That's sort of like what they were founded on. And a lot of conversation around licenses and like who can access this stuff. And it's a lot about just sort of like distributing access to everyone. But I do feel like there's this like more modern era of open source, which I think of as sort of like the GitHub generation, starting maybe like late 2000s or 2010s, that is a little bit more interested in like convenience and just sort of like building things that work and having a platform that supports them, and sort of, I guess, migrating away from this we care about openness as a dogma to more like I just want to do my job and do it well. And I think like with that comes this thinking a little bit more about how do I sort of like manage this influx of like many contributions and doing this at scale. And so yeah, I think like there might be just sort of some critique that comes from like, did early open source manage to reinvent itself a little bit? But I don't know. I think like you can have multiple movements that continue to exist. It's not like this is on some perfect space-time continuum. Like there are free software activists that continue to exist and that I respect, even though I don't think free software is like the front and center like narrative of what is happening in open source. But it doesn't mean that I think their ideas shouldn't exist or are bad. It's just like, you know, the zeitgeist kind of like moves around, and I kind of just want to like shift that point to a more modern kind of place.
Totally. Nadia isn't saying this because she's a very secure and happy person, but what Erik Tornberg, I'm saying that if you haven't tweeted about the book, your silence is deafening.
Thanks, Erik.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so speaking of the different movements in open source, one of the things you sort of chronicle is that some of the leaders of the early movement weren't as politically correct or egalitarian as ones in sort of, you know, today. And part of it is the time is shifting, is times are changing. How has that, besides just sort of the personality of it, how has that influenced sort of the substance of the underlying work itself, if at all?
Just sort of like comparing how it was then to how it is now.
Yeah, the fact that you like Richard Stallman and other couple ones that you chronicle as sort of the leaders and the faces of it. Like it's equivalent of like, you know, when Steve Jobs is the face of an industry versus like, I don't know, Zucker, somebody's face of an industry. Is there a different type of person who goes into it, or is there does the underlying like work change in some way, or is it mostly sort of aesthetic in a way that doesn't affect the core?
Well, so I do think the like earliest days of free and open source software were really characterized by these strong personalities, some of the names which you referenced. And I don't think we like want necessarily like, I mean, some of those personalities are pretty extreme, and it's the same thing, like you said, with like a Steve Jobs type, where some people will say, oh, that, you know, a little bit extreme and we don't really want to show that kind of leadership. And other people will say, yeah, but having those kinds of controversial figures that like put a stake in the ground can also just serve as these rallying points. And so I guess like for better or for worse, the observation on my end is that the very early days of open source really benefited from having that kind of very strong leadership. And then I felt like with this sort of shift to saying, you know, open source is kind of for everyone, and it's trying to just make it extremely welcoming for all types of contributors and acknowledging everyone's contribution, a little bit more of that like egalitarian philosophy, then I feel like we kind of like lost leadership, and there wasn't really any face that emerged. And maybe part of that comes from this reluctance of anyone to like come forth and say and just say like, you know, I care about this thing, because I think the general sentiment was, if you're a maintainer or, you know, like a leader that is beating your chest a little too much, that's seen as sort of like not in the best interest of open source. We don't want these super strong cults of personality. We just want to focus on the collective. And yeah, I do think it ended up, well, maybe that was like a necessary sort of like reaction, I guess, against the early days. And maybe now we can swing back in another direction, and we'll just kind of go back and forth for the end of time. I do think like it had some detrimental effects in sort of, just not acknowledging the agency of maintainers to be able to control their own communities and to be able to lay down the rules that they believe in. And having like tons of people coming in and making these low quality contributions, and you have to spend your time as a maintainer like going through each one and acknowledging them and thanking them for it, because otherwise you're seen as being rude. I think any great idea or movement just like benefits from having some very strong personalities in the room. And I don't think that means that you have to be this angry, abusive leader. Like, I think there are a lot of different ways to be a compelling leader. So I don't think we have to go back to the days of, early Linus Torvalds or something. But yeah, I do think it's currently missing a little bit of that face. Like, the only face I can really put to it right now is GitHub, which is a platform. But I would love to just see maybe more of that shift happening back towards maintainers being recognized for the amazing work that they're doing.
Yeah, I couldn't see Steve Jobs in the same way, sort of be a get away with it in 2020 in the same way. I don't know if you followed Michael Jordan documentary at all, but I couldn't see Michael Jordan similarly, or even Kobe Bryant getting away with sort of his sort of just like win at all costs attitude, like greatness over everything else. Does that resonate with you?
Definitely. I think that's what I sort of want to be quietly more firm about, even in the way that I carry myself day to day at work with friends. And then also with this book, where I just like, I know myself, I'm not going to be the type that is going to be angrily beating people over the head with any sort of thing. And that's probably to my own detriment of, I don't know. I like to see the nuance in things. But I do know what I stand for, and kind of want to model that behavior that I want to see in the world. And so even though I'm not going to be the angry CEO stalking the stage and kind of like yelling at people or whatever, like, I do want to just sort of like quietly affirm at least that yeah, like, I mean, I don't know, I feel like it kind of just makes the world less interesting when there aren't like interesting people to rally around to inspire you. Like, you might not agree with everything they say, but there is the underlying kind of focus on like greatness at all costs. I think there is something nice there about working really hard and sacrificing to do something that you really believe in the world. And I don't resonate as much with the idea that like it's up to me to then kind of find like, where does my own life balance lie for that. But I would rather be striving for like excellence and perfection, and then like figuring out where my like natural balance lies, than to like not even have anything to aspire to at all.
Yeah. Are those two books in your bookshelf right behind you? Is that Nietzsche and Ayn Rand?
No comment.
I'm just kidding. We're on audio. We'll get back to this. I want to go to democracy a little bit. So it's interesting. It seems that we've sort of had this religious belief in democracy. In our last episode, we were talking about Fukuyama's sort of end of history, and how sort of it was thought that was sort of the Western liberal democracy was sort of the best system, and it was sort of above inquiry in some capacity. And we've seen even geopolitically in, say, like the Middle East, there've been a bunch of places where it hasn't worked according to our expectations. We're also, in open source, you sort of bring up a few examples. In crypto, there was all these sort of ideas of innovations on governance, and people said, hey, this is actually really, really hard. Maybe we should just focus on like expanding ownership instead. And so it's interesting. You could imagine sort of democracy losing its sort of like religious, sacredness to it, and us actually, analyzing it just like monarchy, and monarchy perhaps losing its sort of religious, the opposite of sacredness. And maybe us being more open to that form of governance. And if you think, whether it's in private companies, whether it's in protocols, how do you react to this?
I felt like I was kind of ping-ponging back and forth in my head as you were describing that, because I mean, when it comes out, I do feel like it's, the Churchill thing of democracy is the worst form of government we have, but also it's the best worst form of government that we have. And I think that still resonates with me. Like, I do feel like, even though maybe like my team has changed a little bit over the past few years in terms of maybe how I identify politically and things like that, like I don't actually feel like my values have changed that much. Like, I know I really believe in freedom of opportunity for people, but they're like, I think I just want to be more creative with how do we actually get there. And sometimes I think people want to be told what to do, and they benefit from having strong leadership. Sometimes people don't want to be left to sort of just like futz around and fend for themselves. Like, they want beautiful things to aspire to, and they want leaders to aspire to please. And so that can be a really good motivator. And then sometimes it is helpful to have people just sort of like come up with their own ideas and throw things out there. Like, I don't actually want to live in a world where like monarchy is seen as the best form of government, because like you kind of extend that long term, and it means that you don't get some of the best benefits of the internet in the past 20 years, which has been like people coming from out of the woodwork everywhere and being able to show off their own talents and prove themselves. So I think I'm still like very pro democracy. I think it's just more about what is the shell that we're using, or the vehicle to sort of like make that possible. And I just want to be realistic about like when are some of our tools maybe a little bit rusty, a little bit outdated, and we need to come up with new tools that accomplish those same goals better. Maybe that's a little bit naive of me, but you tell me.
Very Straussian. I'm just joking. It is interesting, maybe in the same way that there's sort of like cycles between unbundling and bundling, or fragmentation and consolidation. There's like times to be sort of democratic, and then once you've given everyone a voice, okay, now we need some order, and sort of this like you balance between sort of disruption and order, or this cycle, maybe something like that.
Yeah, right. Like I think like the classic failing of democracy, or even like management, is something I've been thinking about. Is to, I mean, like, yeah, you have this experience where you tell your manager, here are some things that I want to do, and they're like, great, do whatever you think is best. And the first reaction is, oh yeah, that sounds really good. Like this person is just trusting me to do whatever I want. But I think a lot of people have had this experience at work where they're suddenly like, but I actually kind of want your input. Like I kind of, I have my ideas, but I also like want someone who has a vision to like tell me what to do with this information. And so, yeah, I think it's similar with like governments and any sort of like group thing. I mean, this is true for hosting a good party, or like putting together a festival, like events and things like that, where I think there's this, like, the common failure mode is to say, oh, just let people do whatever they want and we'll see what emerges. But if you let everyone do what they want, then like chaos emerges. It's not always a good thing, unless you have like a really small controlled group with like people that have very high context for each other. But yeah, you actually kind of don't want that to happen, because it ends up being a net negative experience for everyone involved. And so like, how do you, as the host, the manager, the leader, the whatever, find ways to sort of like gently nudge people into the right direction and help them be the best that they can be, and like contribute the most that they can to everyone else in the group, while also sort of recognizing, I guess, the creativity that they can bring to the table. So I see those problems as all being very similar.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard one critique of democracy. Well, I suppose a couple actually. One is that it promises too much status to it. It creates sort of a status arms race among its sort of participants in a way that's really unhealthy, and everyone is just sort of like grabbing for power and status, and creating sort of global competitions. Like I guess the one sort of counter analogy, which is a little bit crude, but in China, like people aren't focused as much on sort of like this terrible cancer that is like, politics, and politics, both in terms of like election, but also in terms like they just don't expect as much. Now, of course, they don't get as nearly as much, and I prefer the American system, America, fuck yeah, etc. But in private companies, like this idea of being democratic, it like the more you expect, the more you're going to be unhappy, and the more it's sort of this Girardian sort of arms race to just get more and more status and influence, as opposed to when there's just very clear order, very clear hierarchy, and not to say that there is, and very clear ways to like move up or move down within that hierarchy. But just the idea of expectations as it relates to status, I thought was an interesting critique.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was sort of the underlying point to Fukuyama's thesis around end of history, is like, there is no end of history, because we are always going to be, just seeking after like something more here. It's like inherently a problem that is not resolvable.
The other critique I've heard of sort of democratic systems is that they are basically just sort of like stopping points on the way to communism. Like communism is the logical conclusion of a lot of, because once you sort of, and not just democracy, but even like libertarianism, like once you sort of concede care and fairness as a sort of central point, as of your philosophy, it then follows that you're never caring enough. There's always sort of inequalities. There's always sort of things that can be made better. And once you concede those points, it will just go to this logical conclusion. And my sort of broader thesis is that there's sort of two competing but overlapping forces between sort of like software eats the world, which are like markets, which is sort of like capitalism uninhibited, and then there's sort of egalitarianism uninhibited. But markets and capitalism, while they're really powerful, they do have sort of countermeasures, which is governments. And the only countermeasure to egalitarianism, or just like increase like leftism, actually is is markets. And there's this tension between making things more fair, like process wise, but also making things more fair distributionally. And when you make things more fair process wise, and this is what everyone, this is why sort of, people who are in crypto who are also like socialists are just fundamentally confused is when you process wise, you're just going to have radically disparate outcomes. And yeah, go for it.
Why are markets the only counter to egalitarianism?
Well, in some ways they promote it. I'll give you an example of this is sort of dystopian example. I'll give you Tinder or a dating app. So yeah, before a dating app, you're limited to the people in the bar that you go to or whatever that you'd see, and then Tinder makes it more meritocratic in theory. In that, okay, now you're not just competing with like 10 people, you're competing with like hundreds of people, and thus you should have more efficient markets and get better matches or something like that. And the counter to that is that software creates meritocracies, but it also exposes them. The counter to that is that, okay, now this data is legible and you can, do the stats on who's getting matched and what groups of people aren't getting matched as much, and thus sort of demand that Tinder like regulate the system such that there are more disparate outcomes. So sometimes it overlaps with it or even encourages it. There's this idea that, I'll give you an example. So when you're giving a tip and you're being watched by somebody, you're more likely to give a higher tip than when you're not being watched by somebody. And now we're always being watched by somebody. Like someone's always, and so we're always virtue signaling at all times. And so your original question was how is it counter to egalitarianism?
Yeah, I think I understand that better now. And so what you're saying, I think the perspective I was coming from as you were first talking about it was the counter to egalitarianism is just sort of benevolent dictatorship or benevolent leadership that can sort of knock people out of that. But I think like you're right that markets are still maybe like the intermediary force to sort of expose the data or the way that like things really are in the world, quote unquote, to even I think like if people don't feel a sense of like unrest around egalitarianism, then having leadership swaying them in another direction is not helpful, because they need to like want it or they need to like see the conflict, which is not something that just sort of like coming in and saying so is going to do. So that makes more sense to me.
Yeah, and so my theory is basically that anything that can be made into software or like be made into a market will be made into a market unless there's something actively preventing it, and that's often governments. And then similarly, like egalitarianism will just seep into everything unless something actively stops. And there are like pockets of reactionary, anti-egalitarian behavior, and so it's not always like up and to the right for egalitarianism, but just like since Jesus, it just seems like it's been pretty hockey stick growth.
Since Jesus is a good flex right there.
Yeah. So what would Glenn Weil say if he read your book and was listening to, the first 30 minutes of this conversation before we went off the rails? Like, because he would say that like Apple is like totalitarian. Like he thinks that we're just missing, that companies would just be way better if they were more democratic. Like what does he disagree with you? And I'm not going to implicate myself in this. What does he disagree with you on, you think? What would Glenn say?
It's been a little while since I've dug into Glenn's ideas, but I would say probably, so yeah, I mean, tell me what you think of this, but I think Glenn and I maybe identify similar problems, but have different solutions or approaches to it. Glenn looking, I think, a little bit more at how do we sort of turn power over to a broader set of people. I'm just sort of thinking about like the concept of quadratic voting and how it really is about like leveraging like sort of like collective interests in a way that still overcomes the problem of like one person, one vote. So I think we're like, again, identifying the same problem there, but maybe having a different, like, whereas I might kind of be like, we just sort of need more people in charge to be a little bit more decisive about what they want and communicating that. I think he's looking for ways to maybe more explicitly preserve that idea of like participation. Whereas I think I'm sort of like maybe jaded on participation or just don't think it's always as realistic to implement. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, no, that does. And I think it's also for the participants themselves. Like, participation is not going to give you what you want always.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
Like, and it depends what you mean by participation, but I think there's sort of like a collective, like if status is sort of this arms race, there needs to be like some systems that can like collectively allow us to bow out such that like we don't have to enter, and it's like for our own good.
Yeah.
And social media just puts us in a constant global status game in the way that we never were before. You just be with your family and have a nice life.
Yeah. I had this sort of feeling that like when we're dissatisfied by people that are in charge, it's because we just don't like the vision that is being put forth to us. But it doesn't mean that we don't like leaders, if that makes sense. Like I think a leader with a compelling enough vision and this benevolent dictator style of governance and someone who does it really well, like ideally should not even be thinking about like, is someone doing something in behind the scenes? Like I often think about like Burning Man in this way, not to be that person making Burning Man references on a podcast, but like, I mean, Burning Man is amazing in the sense that it is like, so self-organized, but like people also miss that under the surface, there is I think they call like department of like, I don't know, whatever. They have like essentially like a maintenance crew of people that are like behind the scenes making this feeling of like, wow, we built it all ourselves possible. But like, it's not like there is some coordination happening. It's just relatively invisible. And it does. And so I think like that's an example of just a place where I've seen this really nice marriage of both like I have the agency to change the things that I want to change in my day-to-day life. I can, wear the costumes I want to wear. I can make my camp look the way I want it to look or things like that. But then like the underlying infrastructure of like who's bringing like the porta potties to this place, who's like defining like what our values are, like where did the Burning Man values come from? They didn't come from some, thousands of people sitting together and taking a vote on it. They came from like the vision of a certain set of people. And so I think like they do a good job of like, I don't even realize all the things that I don't have to think about. I'm just sort of like there enjoying my time. And so that to me is like sort of like the perfect balance that I would love to see like more people be able to strike and more organizations.
Totally. I just went to my first Burning Man ever over Zoom and I totally get it now.
Oh my God.
I totally see what everyone has been talking about these last decades. So I'm glad.
Congratulations, Erik.
Yeah. Sympathize, relate, resonate. So yeah, it's interesting. Biology's vision and other people's vision too is basically this idea where there's like strong leaders, but just a lot of choice. And so, and you become a leader yourself. And so there's just like just a competitive set such that you could find or create the perfect situation for you, inclusive of a highly participatory in every element of. There's just the challenge here, of course, is that both in companies and obviously countries that their power consolidates or just becomes monopolistic, and it's in their incentive to prevent others from arising. And we have some ways to stop this at the private level with sort of new sort of technologies and protocols, and then regulation. On a country level, it's way harder to even think about what would be the infrastructure that would prevent monopolistic behavior. But it's interesting to think about.
Yeah.
Biology had this quote, which was the East Coast and West Coast have a different mentality to money. The East Coast is like conflict of interest. If you have an investment in something, your word is less credible. Whereas the West Coast is more put your money where your mouth is. If you don't have an investment in something, your word is less credible. And then of course there's sort of this West Coast East Coast like media battle. Is it as simple as old money versus new money, or how should we sort of think about East Coast West Coast mentality, broadly generalized?
Yeah, I think a little bit of it is the old money versus new money thing, or just sort of like institutions versus new institutions, or something that is not old versus new. I don't know, is maybe the most reductive way to say it. Yeah, I do often hesitate to say East Coast versus West Coast, even though it often kind of breaks down the way, but it feels like it doesn't actually include, for example, when I'm talking about philanthropy, like Gates Foundation is a huge thing, but you could call that West Coast as much as it is East Coast. So yeah, I don't. And I just like, I don't know, I don't love falling into like sort of geographic kind of identity politics, I guess. But yeah, there is something to me around, again, just looking at like where those like wealth booms have happened. And like, to me, it really just does speak to the value of like concentrated wealth and being able to engender a lot of cultural change. And because we can kind of like tie different eras of conversation and norms and just sort of like movements to like where do those concentrations of wealth happen. And so one of them is sort of more New York-ish and one is maybe more San Francisco-ish. But yeah, I don't know what that looks like in the long term. I'm still sort of watching and waiting. All I know, I guess, for myself is I grew up on the East Coast, so I'm certainly no stranger to it and don't even dislike it or anything like that. But I've been in San Francisco for 10 years now and definitely feel like I kind of grew up and my career kind of grew up in and around tech. So I feel just a strong affinity to it and just seeing like, I don't know, all the enormous opportunity that is created, just not just for me, but plenty of people. I do just feel like when I look at stories in the media and stuff, like I don't see myself in it. I don't see my friends in it. There is this need for just sort of like cultural artifacts that can represent what is happening here. And I find it particularly more egregious that we have done so much stuff and have had so much impact on the world, but like basically no one really knows what is going on here. And the only depictions are sort of like these caricatures that like no one here really feels represents them. And so I do hope that like 5 or 10 years from now, we can look back and be like, oh, that was kind of like goofy that that like these like movies or like news articles were written portraying tech as sort of like a caricature. But like I'm so glad now that we have these more like I guess authentic stories that we can tell. And so yeah, I mean that's almost not even like a tech specific thing. It's just sort of like, I mean, for anyone, I think if you're looking at what's happening in like mainstream media and saying like that doesn't look like me or that doesn't represent me, then like get to work, start like telling your own story in your own way. I hope that's a sentiment that a lot of people can identify with, regardless of whether you take any sort of part in like East versus West Coast politics.
When people talk about the culture war, what are they talking about? Like, help me sense make around the culture war, and like, have we always been in a culture war? and I just didn't know it. Like, what comes to mind when you hear that? How do you sense make around it?
All right. Well, what comes to mind for me is like for a while, this is like Nadia's abridged and very subjective history that might be entirely wrong, but it's mostly just based on my own experience. So I don't know, like take it as you will. But my experience of this has been coming to San Francisco and feeling like, oh, this is like a totally different place from like, you know, the East Coast I came from. And people here are building things and they're like having impact on the world. And like basically no one knows that they exist. I just saw like this tweet from Paul Graham, I think today, that was like a photo of the Airbnb founders giving a talk at like an early Y Combinator kind of dinner and holding their like, you know, McCain Captain Crunch box or whatever, and saying he was just sort of like nostalgic for like 10 years ago. Like no one out there cared at all what we were doing. And they might start using Airbnb, for example, but like just have like no idea like who the founders are, or, like what the deal is. And then I felt like 2016 was this like sharp turning point, which is, I think we're all just had a lot of whiplash over, where the Democrats lost the presidential election, and suddenly I think we're sort of like looking for someone to blame, and Facebook kind of landed in their crosshairs, whether that is true or not. But I think like it was probably long-term beneficial for both sides in that like Facebook was sort of like shying away from saying, yes, we are a platform and billions of people use us, but like we're, you know, we don't have any influence on things like the election. And so that level of like extreme dissatisfaction, I think, at like losing a battle kind of led like the outside world to start like scrutinizing tech and be like, what is going on in here? How are these people like able to like control these distribution channels? And we just like basically didn't see them exist. And I think like both sides kind of failed here, because the outside world was just like totally underestimating and not paying attention to what was happening in tech. And then the tech world was also not paying attention to how important it would be to be able to like control their narrative outside of the tech world. I think like there was maybe this like naive idea that maybe like tech could, and like, you know, the outside world could just sort of like peacefully coexist and no one would ever really pay attention to what was going on here. Like, I don't really know what the end game was, but it seems like that was kind of like the sentiment. And so now with like all this increased scrutiny, now you're seeing like, okay, we all have to coexist in the same public conversation, where we are being forced to kind of like play with people that might not really understand tech, or maybe like very anti-tech, and like how do we then shape our own narrative and kind of take control of that a little bit. So I do feel like the like culture war that you're referring to is like really only started maybe like 4 years ago and has been super heating up in maybe like the past 2 years or something like that.
What else happened 4 years ago? My abridged version is that basically Silicon Valley's to sort of the sort of elite establishment just became like it too big for its britches a little bit, in the sense of in the beginning it was this upstart. It helped elect Obama. It helped start this sort of what was the Twitter revolution, the Arab Spring. It was doing all these sort of amazing things for sort of leftist institutions and elite institutions, and then it got too close to the sun and actually started to threaten those same institutions, right? Netflix threatened the studios, Lambda and university, MOOCs threatened universities to some extent, or they threatened their hegemony, and Peter Thiel's the thing around that. And then also, you have BuzzFeed and Vox, and sort of now they're sort of considered old media, but you have these new, Silicon Valley upstarts that are disrupting old East Coast media institutions. And I'm actually, it's funny, we're seeing like this alliance between sort of East Coast media defects and technologists and Silicon Valley in an interesting way. But it basically just got too powerful. And then Trump was just the sort of like, you needed a scapegoat around that. And so as it got too powerful, it was no longer an ally to these elitist institutions, and now is a enemy.
Yeah, I think some of that maybe resonates of this is what happens, kind of go back to what we were saying before of like any new institution as it's being created is always going to end up threatening whatever came before it. And so, yeah, I sort of like maybe depersonalize it a little bit more than that. But yeah, at some point when other people start getting power that aren't you, then you're going to start wanting to like check them on that power, basically. Which to me is actually just a sign of tech's growing influence. So I don't think it's even a long-term bad thing. They're just sort of like inevitable scuffles that have to be resolved.
Totally. What's the narrative that Silicon Valley needs to tell, you think, or needs to get better at telling? Some people alternate between sort of the progress studies stuff versus more like transhumanism stuff versus like other, like what do you think is sort of the narratives that we should be telling?
I mean, so many things. One place I think I would start, since it seems to be sort of like all consuming for people outside of tech, is just sort of like, I guess, like the quote unquote ethics of technology. And it seems like there's like a lot of the anti-tech sentiment seems to come from this feeling of like, oh, we somehow like, I don't know, like created these things that are like bad for the world. I mean, it's, to me, it is honestly not that different from like the oil barons of yore, that like, yeah, oil did a lot of things that are bad for the world, but also there are a lot of great things that came out of that. And so, yeah, I think like maybe like just sort of that's a place where I would like to see just more of our own like real personality and DNA being injected into that conversation, where I don't think like all the technology we've created here is like necessarily bad. It just needs to be understood better. And yeah, like what does that, it's not like we're selling, like to me, it's not like we're selling cigarettes. Like I think there's an argument to be made that like a lot of this stuff is good and like it just needs to be understood and like shaped. And I see that as an opportunity, not as like a horrible thing that has been put into the world. Call me, it's weird that is maybe such a strange or controversial thing to say, but like I love tech. I'm happy to be here and I'm really proud of like the things that like Silicon Valley has managed to build. So like I think just like taking some pride in that, and then like maybe another aspect is so much I think of the conversation still centers around like startups and venture capital and like getting rich and stuff. And like, yeah, to me, that is like a part of the story of tech and why people come here. But there's so many more characters. Like to me, tech is just this very richly textured landscape of different characters, motives, just ways of connecting to this topic that aren't really being seen or represented in mainstream media.
Yeah, I would love to see someone who's as good at writing as Anna Wiener is write that story, because I feel like her is just kind of sort of the normal trope, like anti-tropes that sort of raise one's own status to make. It's a good book. Not to put it down. I'll end on this. You reimagined your PhD. I effectively did it, and you wrote a blog post about it. You did it sort of DIY style. Kanye West just tweeted out yesterday, like, we need a YC for the music industry. Is it sort of like YC for everything? How do you sort of think about, like, when you think about the future of grad school based on your own experience and what you see, what does it look like?
The lazy guess would be probably what's happening to all sort of institutions unbundling right now. Well, I guess I'll make the argument for and against. Like one just being like we are moving down to these sort of like atomized creators, and so yeah, like I'm very optimistic, and I really encourage other people to also, like, if you have an area of study that you find interesting and you don't think that there is like coursework in a university that is going to help you get there, which is how I felt about open source. Like I didn't feel like learning from academics was going to like help me understand open source better. I thought talking to software developers was going to help. And so like, that's sort of why I structured it the way I did. And I think like a lot of people have topics like that where you're just like, I'm weirdly obsessed with this thing and I want to go like understand it better. Like you don't have to go to grad school to do that. And so, yeah, I think we'll hopefully be seeing just more people with the rise, I think, of just sort of like subscription businesses that are supporting creators more broadly, like Substack, where I work, where, yeah, you can like, start a newsletter and just like, and start making money off of paid subscriptions. Like I think that kind of stuff can fuel more people to pursue their own independent areas of study. The flip side is like, I think maybe we'll do that for a while. Like we're still in that like unbundling phase, and then we'll be like unbundled for a bit. But then at some point there will probably be some like reorganizing that will happen. Like I do think the benefit to universities is that it's like the only sort of like stable, legible career path to knowledge work. At least like at its best, it can be that. And I think that's a really amazing thing too. Like right now, if you want to pursue an independent area study, you have to basically be, have enough savings to be able to do it, or kind of luck into different situations like I did, that where you can find people to kind of like help you pay your bills. And so I do hope that somewhere down the line, whether it's through universities or some other sort of institution, that we're able to actually provide a more stable path for people that want to pursue this kind of work, and not constantly have to sort of like grovel for gigs the way like I felt like I kind of still do.
Totally. I think that's a great place to wrap. My guest has been Nadia Eghbal. The book is working in public. Recommend reading it. Read Nadia's newsletter on Substack. Create your own Substack. Nadia runs Writer Experience Substack. Nadia, thanks for coming back on the podcast. This has been a great episode.
Thank you, Erik.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.